The metal handcuffs bit into Colonel Rachel Montgomery's wrists as Officer Derek Jameson shoved her roughly against the chain-link fence outside Murphy's Bar. The late afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, and Rachel could feel the eyes of a dozen onlookers burning into her back. She maintained her composure, her spine straight despite the humiliating position, her gray eyes calm even as rage simmered beneath the surface. "You military types think you're so special," Jameson sneered, his breath reeking of stale coffee and something stronger. "Out here in the real world, you're just another troublemaker who can't handle her liquor." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Rachel said nothing, her jaw set in a hard line. She hadn't touched a drop of alcohol, hadn't even been inside the bar. She'd been walking to her car after a difficult meeting with the town council about veteran housing when she'd witnessed Jameson and his partner Officer Mills roughing up an elderly homeless veteran named Tommy Chen. When she'd intervened, showing her military identification and requesting they treat the man with dignity, Jameson had exploded. "Did you hear me, lady?" Jameson barked, pressing closer. "I asked you a question." "I heard you perfectly, officer," Rachel replied, her voice steady and professional despite her position. "And I'll repeat what I told you before. I'm Colonel Rachel Montgomery, commanding officer of the 342nd Engineering Regiment. I was attempting to ensure that Mr. Chen received appropriate treatment when you decided to assault a superior officer." Jameson's face flushed red. "Superior officer? You're not in charge of anything out here, Colonel. This is my jurisdiction. And you're under arrest for public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and interfering with a police investigation." The crowd in the parking lot had grown larger, phones emerging from pockets to record the scene. Rachel caught sight of Tommy Chen being loaded into the back of the second patrol car, his weathered face creased with worry as he looked back at her. She gave him the slightest nod, hoping to convey that everything would be all right. But inside, Rachel's mind was racing. She'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, commanded over 800 personnel, and earned a chest full of commendations including the Bronze Star. She'd built bridges under enemy fire and led rescue operations in hostile territory. And now she was handcuffed to a fence by a small-town police officer who seemed to take pleasure in her humiliation. "You know what I think?" Jameson continued, warming to his theme as his partner Mills stood silently by, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. "I think you military people come back home thinking you can boss everyone around. Well, not in my town, not on my watch." Rachel's phone, which had been clipped to her belt, began to ring. The display showed Lt. Rodriguez, one of her most trusted officers. Jameson glanced at it with a smirk. "Looks like someone's worried about you," he said. "Too bad they can't help you now." What Jameson didn't know was that Lieutenant Sofia Rodriguez was not just any officer. She was Rachel's second in command, a brilliant tactician with a fierce loyalty to her colonel and an extensive network throughout the military community. More importantly, she was currently stationed less than 5 miles away at Fort Harrison with the rest of the 342nd Engineering Regiment. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. This time it showed Major Williams, then SGT Peterson. One after another, Rachel's officers were trying to reach her. "Popular lady," Jameson observed with mock admiration. "Shame none of them can save you from spending the night in lockup." Rachel finally allowed herself a small smile, which seemed to unnerve Jameson more than her earlier silence. "Officer Jameson," she said quietly, "I strongly suggest you reconsider your course of action. This situation can still be resolved professionally and with dignity for all parties involved." "Is that a threat?" Jameson's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon. "It's advice," Rachel replied calmly. From someone who spent her entire adult life learning how to de-escalate dangerous situations. 6 months earlier, Colonel Rachel Montgomery had stood before a different crowd in a very different setting. The Pentagon's Memorial Amphitheater was filled with dignitaries, fellow officers, and the families of the soldiers she'd served alongside. She was receiving the Distinguished Service Medal for her leadership during Operation Mountain Shield, where her engineering regiment had constructed a series of strategic bridges under constant enemy fire, enabling the evacuation of an entire Afghan village. At 42, Rachel was one of the youngest colonels in the Army Corps of Engineers, and certainly one of the few who had risen through the ranks on merit alone rather than political connections. Born in rural Montana to a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, Rachel had learned early that respect was earned through actions, not words. Her military career had begun 18 years earlier when she'd enlisted straight out of high school, unable to afford college and unwilling to burden her mother with student loans. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood had been brutal, but Rachel had thrived under the discipline and structure. She'd discovered an aptitude for engineering and logistics that had earned her a slot in officer candidate school, followed by a degree in civil engineering funded by the Army. 3 deployments to Afghanistan had shaped her leadership philosophy. Take care of your people first, lead by example, and never ask someone to do something you wouldn't do yourself. These principles had served her well in the mountains of Helmand Province and the bureaucratic maze of the Pentagon alike. The 342nd Engineering Regiment had been her command for 2 years now, and she'd transformed what had been a demoralized unit with serious morale problems into one of the most effective and respected regiments in the Corps. Her officers and NCOs didn't just follow her orders. They believed in her vision and trusted her judgment absolutely. That trust had been tested repeatedly. During the flooding in Louisiana the previous year, Rachel had deployed her regiment to assist with disaster relief. When local officials had initially been reluctant to allow military personnel to operate in their jurisdiction, Rachel had spent hours in meetings, building relationships and demonstrating her unit's capabilities. By the end of the operation, the 342nd had rebuilt 3 crucial bridges and saved an estimated 40 lives. It was this experience that had brought her to Millbrook, a small town about 30 minutes from Fort Harrison that was struggling with a growing homeless veteran population and inadequate housing infrastructure. The town council had requested military assistance in developing a comprehensive housing plan, and Rachel had volunteered to lead the preliminary assessment personally. The meeting that afternoon had not gone well. Mayor Patricia Hendricks, a well-meaning but overwhelmed woman in her 60s, had been supportive of the military's involvement. But City Councilman Brad Stevens, a local real estate developer, had been openly hostile to the idea of using military resources for what he called handouts to deadbeats. These people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, Stevens had declared during the heated discussion. The military's job is to fight wars, not coddle people who can't handle civilian life. Rachel had maintained her professional demeanor throughout the meeting, but Stevens' dismissive attitude toward veterans had rankled her. When she'd politely pointed out that many homeless veterans were struggling with combat-related PTSD and physical disabilities, Stevens had waved her off. "That's just excuses," he'd said. "I know plenty of veterans who came home and made something of themselves. The ones living on the streets are there because they want to be." The meeting had ended without resolution, with Mayor Hendricks promising to schedule a follow-up session once tempers had cooled. Rachel had left City Hall frustrated, but determined to find a way to help the veterans of Millbrook, even if it meant working around people like Stevens. She'd been walking to her car, parked behind Murphy's Bar on Main Street, when she'd heard the commotion. 2 police officers were confronting an elderly Asian man who appeared to be homeless, their voices raised and aggressive. Rachel's training kicked in immediately, assess the situation, identify potential threats, protect innocent civilians. Elderly man was Tommy Chen, a Vietnam veteran she'd actually met earlier that day outside the VA clinic. He was 73 years old, walked with a pronounced limp from shrapnel wounds, and suffered from severe PTSD that made it difficult for him to maintain stable housing. He'd been polite and coherent when they'd spoken, grateful for her interest in helping local veterans. Now he was being roughly handled by two officers who seemed far more interested in flexing their authority than understanding the situation. Rachel had approached with her hands visible and her military ID ready, introducing herself professionally and asking what seemed to be the problem. That's when she'd met Officers Derek Jameson and Paul Mills for the first time. Derek Jameson had been a police officer in Millbrook for 8 years, and in his mind, that made him an expert on everything that happened within the town limits. At 35, he was a thick-set man with a buzz cut and cold blue eyes who carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never been seriously challenged. His partner, Paul Mills, was newer to the force and considerably more uncomfortable with Jameson's aggressive approach to policing. Mills had only been on the job for 2 years and still remembered his training about community policing and de-escalation techniques. But Jameson was the senior officer, and Mills had learned that questioning his methods led to uncomfortable conversations with their sergeant. The call that afternoon had been routine. A report of a suspicious individual behind Murphy's bar. The caller had described Tommy Chen as probably drunk or on drugs, simply because he'd been sitting on a milk crate behind the dumpster, apparently talking to himself. In reality, Tommy had been having a PTSD episode, triggered by the smell of cooking grease from the bar's kitchen that reminded him of a particular firefight near Da Nang in 1969. When the officers had arrived, Tommy had been disoriented and frightened. Instead of recognizing the signs of psychological distress, Jameson had immediately assumed he was dealing with a drunk vagrant who needed to be moved along. His approach had been to bark orders and make threats, which had only made Tommy more agitated. That's when Rachel had appeared, calm and professional, her military bearing immediately apparent even in civilian clothes. She'd shown her identification, introduced herself as Colonel Montgomery, and politely asked if she could help de-escalate the situation. Jameson's response had been immediate and hostile. He'd seen the military ID, heard the rank, and something inside him had snapped. Throughout his career, he'd nursed a deep resentment toward the military, born from his own failed attempt to join the Marines 15 years earlier. He'd been rejected during the psychological evaluation, told he had authority issues and difficulty working within a team structure. The rejection had stung, especially when several of his high school classmates had gone on to successful military careers. Now, faced with a decorated colonel who was clearly trying to help, Jameson saw an opportunity to assert his own authority. He'd ordered Rachel to move along and mind her own business. When she'd politely explained that as a fellow veteran, she considered Tommy's welfare very much her business, Jameson had made his first critical mistake. "I don't care what your rank is in the Army," he'd said, his voice rising. "Out here, I'm in charge, and you're just another civilian who needs to learn her place." Rachel had remained calm, but Tommy had become more agitated, clearly distressed by the confrontation. That's when she'd made the decision to step between the officers and the elderly veteran, asking them to give him some space while she helped him calm down. Jameson had interpreted this as defiance of his authority. In his mind, this military officer was challenging him in front of witnesses, undermining his credibility as a law enforcement professional. His solution had been to escalate the situation rather than de-escalate it. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest," he'd announced. Reaching for his handcuffs, Rachel had been shocked. "On what charge, officer?" "Public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and interfering with a police investigation. I haven't been drinking, I haven't been disorderly, and I was trying to help you resolve the situation peacefully." But Jameson was beyond reason now. The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation with Tommy had grown larger, and he felt the need to demonstrate his power. Rachel's calm professionalism only made him angrier. Here was someone who clearly commanded respect wherever she went, while he felt like he had to fight for every scrap of authority. The handcuffing had been unnecessarily rough and chaining. Her to the fence had been pure vindictiveness. Mills had started to object, but a sharp look from his partner had silenced him. Now, 15 minutes later, they stood in the parking lot with a growing crowd of onlookers and a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond their control. Rachel's phone had been ringing almost continuously, and each time Jameson had made another disparaging comment about the military. What he didn't understand was that each unanswered call was being noted by the officers of the 342nd Engineering Regiment, and wheels were already in motion that would soon transform this small-town police incident into something much larger. Lieutenant Sofia Rodriguez had been in the middle of reviewing construction blueprints for a new barracks project when Colonel Montgomery's call went to voicemail for the second time. As the 342nd's executive officer, she knew Rachel's schedule better than anyone, and the colonel was never unreachable during duty hours without good reason. Sofia was 29 years old, a graduate of West Point who had earned Rachel's respect through her exceptional organizational skills and absolute loyalty to her troops. She'd served as Rachel's XO for 18 months, and in that time had learned to read her commander's moods and anticipate her needs with almost telepathic accuracy. Third call that went unanswered triggered Sofia's internal alarm system. She immediately tried calling Major Tom Williams, the regiment's operations officer, who was supposed to be attending the same meeting in Millbrook. "Tom, this is Sofia. Where's the colonel?" Major Williams was in his car, driving back from the disastrous town council meeting. "She stayed behind to check on something," he said. "Said she'd catch up with us later." "Why?" "She's not answering her phone. That's not like her." Tom pulled over to the side of the road, his own concerns mounting. Rachel Montgomery was many things, but unreachable wasn't one of them. She carried her phone religiously and had trained her staff to expect immediate responses during business hours. "I'm turning around," Tom said. "Something's wrong." While Tom headed back toward Millbrook, Sofia activated the regiment's informal communication network. Within minutes, she had half a dozen officers trying to reach their colonel. When none of the calls went through, she made a decision that would prove crucial. She contacted Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, the regiment's senior NCO and Rachel's most trusted enlisted advisor. Sergeant Santos was 41 years old, a career soldier who had served with Rachel in Afghanistan and had followed her to the 342nd when she took command. If anyone could figure out what had happened to their colonel, it would be Maria. "Ma'am, I'm already on it," Santos told Sofia when she called. "I've got contacts throughout the area. Give me 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes felt like an hour to Sofia, but Santos' network of former military personnel, VA employees, and local veterans was thorough and efficient. The call came back exactly 9 minutes later. "Lieutenant, we've got a problem. The colonel's been arrested by Millbrook PD, handcuffed to a fence outside Murphy's bar, multiple witnesses, and it doesn't look good." Sofia felt her blood run cold. Rachel Montgomery was one of the most professional officers she'd ever served under. The idea that she'd done anything to warrant arrest was absurd. "What are the charges?" "From what I'm hearing, public intoxication and interfering with police business." "Ma'am, the colonel doesn't drink, and she sure as hell doesn't interfere with legitimate police work." "I'm mobilizing the command staff," Sofia said without hesitation. "This is either a massive misunderstanding or something a lot worse." While Sofia began making calls, Sergeant Santos was already in her car, driving toward Millbrook. She'd served in some of the most dangerous places on earth, but the thought of her colonel being mistreated by local police filled her with a cold fury that surprised her with its intensity. The 342nd Engineering Regiment wasn't just a military unit, it was a family. Rachel Montgomery had spent 2 years building that family, creating bonds of trust and mutual respect that went far beyond the normal chain of command. Every officer and NCO in the regiment would walk through fire for their colonel, not because regulations required it, but because they believed in her absolutely. Now, that family was mobilizing. Major Williams arrived at Murphy's Bar first, his staff car pulling into the parking lot, just as Officer Mills was beginning to look seriously uncomfortable with the situation. The crowd had grown to about 30 people, many of them recording the scene with their phones, and Rachel remained handcuffed to the fence with stoic dignity. Tom Williams was 6 feet 4 inches tall and built like the former college linebacker he'd been before joining the Army. When he emerged from his car in his dress uniform, his major's oak leaves gleaming on his collar, the crowd parted instinctively. He took in the scene with a single glance, his jaw tightening as he saw his commanding officer chained like a common criminal. "Colonel Montgomery," he said formally, coming to attention despite the circumstances. "Major Williams," Rachel replied calmly. "I find myself in a rather unusual situation." Tom turned to face Officer Jameson, who was beginning to realize that the situation might be more complicated than he'd thought. "Officer, I'm Major Thomas Williams, Operations Officer for the 342nd Engineering Regiment. I'm here to inquire about the circumstances of Colonel Montgomery's detention." Jameson puffed up his chest, determined not to be intimidated by another military officer. "Your colonel is under arrest for public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and interfering with a police investigation. She'd be processed and arraigned like any other criminal." Tom's eyes narrowed. "Colonel Montgomery doesn't drink alcohol, officer. Haven't you administered a breathalyzer test?" For the first time, Jameson looked uncertain. The truth was, he'd been so focused on asserting his authority that he hadn't bothered with standard procedures. Rachel clearly wasn't intoxicated, but admitting that now would undermine his entire justification for the arrest. "That's not your concern," he said defensively. "This is police business." "Actually," Tom replied calmly, "when you arrest one of the Army's most decorated officers on what appear to be false charges, it becomes very much our business." That's when the sound of multiple vehicles approaching made everyone in the parking lot turn. A convoy of military vehicles was heading down Main Street, staff cars, transport trucks, and leading them all. A Humvee with the distinctive markings of the 342nd Engineering Regiment. Sergeant Santos had made some calls of her own. The first vehicle to arrive was Sergeant Santos' Humvee, followed closely by a staff car carrying Captain Jennifer Liu, the regiment's intelligence officer, and Lieutenant Mark Chun, the transportation platoon leader. Behind them came 2 transport trucks filled with NCOs and enlisted personnel who had volunteered to accompany their senior staff to Millbrook. Officer Mills watched the growing military presence with mounting alarm. He'd started the day expecting to handle routine patrol duties, and now he found himself in the middle of what appeared to be a major incident involving high-ranking military personnel. His training had covered many scenarios, but what to do when you've arrested a colonel and her entire regiment shows up hadn't been one of them. Sergeant Santos emerged from her Humvee with the controlled fury of a professional soldier who'd seen her commanding officer dishonored. At 5 feet 6 inches tall, she might not have been physically imposing, but her presence commanded immediate attention from everyone in the parking lot. "Colonel," she said formally, coming to attention in front of Rachel despite the awkward circumstances. "Sergeant Santos," Rachel replied with a slight smile. "I appreciate your concern, but this is a civilian matter that needs to be resolved through proper channels. With respect, ma'am, when they chain my colonel to a fence like a dog, it becomes everyone's matter." The crowd had grown significantly, now with local residents emerging from shops and restaurants to see what was happening. Many of them had phones out, recording everything. And Officer Jameson was beginning to realize that this incident was going to be seen by a lot more people than he'd anticipated. Captain Liu approached Tom Williams and spoke quietly. "Sir, I've been monitoring social media. Videos of the colonel's arrest are already being shared. We've got news crews from 3 different stations en route." Tom nodded grimly. Rachel Montgomery was well known in military circles and had received significant media attention for her engineering innovations and humanitarian work. Her arrest was going to be major news, especially given the circumstances. Lieutenant Chen had positioned himself near the fence where Rachel was detained, and he was quietly documenting everything he observed. As the regiment's transportation officer, he was also responsible for logistics and had already calculated how long it would take to bring additional personnel from Fort Harrison if the situation escalated further. "Officer," Tom Williams addressed Jameson again, "I strongly recommend you reconsider your course of action. Colonel Montgomery is a decorated combat veteran with an impeccable service record. These charges appear to be baseless, and continuing to hold her is only going to make this situation worse." Jameson's face reddened. "Are you threatening me, Major?" "I'm advising you as one professional to another. You have an opportunity to resolve this situation with dignity. I suggest you take it." But Jameson was beyond rational thought now. The presence of so many military personnel felt like an invasion of his territory, and his pride wouldn't let him back down. In his mind, releasing Rachel now would be seen as capitulation to military pressure. "Your colonel is going to jail," he declared loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "And if any of you try to interfere, you'll join her." That's when Captain Sarah Kim arrived. Captain Kim was the 342nd's legal officer, a former JAG Corps attorney who had transferred to the Corps of Engineers to work on military construction law. She was also one of the most brilliant legal minds in the regiment, with a particular expertise in the complex intersection between military and civilian law. She emerged from her staff car carrying a thick file folder and wearing the expression of someone who had already researched every relevant statute and regulation. Captain Kim was 32 years old, had graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, and had spent 4 years as a prosecutor before joining the military. She was exactly the wrong person for Officer Jameson to try to intimidate. "Officer Jameson," she said formally, approaching him with her credentials clearly displayed. "I'm Captain Sarah Kim, legal counsel for the 342nd Engineering Regiment. I need to inform you that you are currently violating several federal statutes regarding the detention of military personnel." Jameson scowled. "This is a civilian matter. Your military laws don't apply here." Captain Kim opened her folder and withdrew a document. "Actually, they do. Under 10 U.S.C. 987, military personnel detained by civilian authorities must be afforded certain procedural protections. You haven't administered a breathalyzer test despite charges of public intoxication. You haven't allowed the suspect to make a phone call, and you've subjected her to degrading and unnecessary restraint methods." She handed him the document. "This is a formal complaint on filing with the State Attorney General's office regarding your conduct. I'm also notifying the FBI's Civil Rights Division about potential violations of federal law." For the first time since the incident began, Jameson looked genuinely concerned. He wasn't a lawyer, but he understood that federal investigators and state attorneys general had the power to end his career. "Furthermore," Captain Kim continued, "I'm prepared to file a Section 1983 lawsuit against both you personally and the Millbrook Police Department for deprivation of civil rights under color of law. The damages Colonel Montgomery could claim for this incident would likely bankrupt this municipality." Mills finally found his voice. "Derek, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Jameson snapped. But his confidence was clearly shaken. Captain Kim turned to address the growing crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, you are witnessing the unlawful detention of Colonel Rachel Montgomery, a decorated combat veteran who was attempting to assist an elderly Vietnam veteran in distress. I encourage you to continue documenting this incident, as your recordings may be crucial evidence in the federal civil rights investigation that will inevitably follow. The effect was immediate. More phones came out, and several people began live streaming the incident on social media. Jameson realized that whatever happened next was going to be preserved forever and seen by thousands of people. That's when the news crews arrived. The first news van to arrive belonged to WKTV, the regional affiliate that covered military affairs. From Fort Harrison, reporter Jessica Martinez emerged from the van with her camera crew, took one look at the scene, and immediately recognized the story of a lifetime. Jessica had covered the military beat for 5 years and knew Colonel Montgomery by reputation. Rachel's humanitarian work, her engineering innovations, and her leadership during natural disasters had made her something of a local celebrity in military circles. Seeing her handcuffed to a fence was shocking enough to stop Jessica in her tracks. "Holy shit," she whispered to her cameraman. "Are you getting this?" Within minutes, 2 more news crews had arrived, followed by reporters from the regional newspaper and several freelance journalists who monitored police scanners for breaking news. The parking lot behind Murphy's bar was rapidly becoming a media circus. Officer Mills pulled his partner aside. "Derek, this is getting out of hand. Maybe we should call the sergeant." But Jameson was trapped now by his own ego and the public nature of the confrontation. With cameras rolling and reporters shouting questions, backing down would be seen as an admission that he'd been wrong from the beginning. "I don't care if she's a general," he said loudly enough for the microphones to pick up. "In this town, everyone follows the same laws." Rachel, who had remained silent throughout most of the incident, finally spoke again. "Officer Jameson, I respect your authority as a law enforcement professional, but I also know my rights as an American citizen and a military officer. What you're doing here is wrong, and you know it." Her calm dignity in the face of such treatment was striking, especially when contrasted with Jameson's increasingly erratic behavior. The reporters recognized good television when they saw it, and every camera was focused on the handcuffed colonel, who carried herself with more authority than her captor. Jessica Martinez managed to get close enough to address Rachel directly. "Colonel Montgomery, can you tell us what happened here?" Rachel looked directly into the camera, her gray eyes steady and professional. "I was attempting to assist an elderly Vietnam veteran who appeared to be in distress when these officers arrived. I identified myself and offered to help de-escalate the situation. Instead of accepting that assistance, Officer Jameson chose to arrest me on charges that have no basis in fact." "Are you saying these charges are false?" Jessica pressed. "I haven't consumed any alcohol today or any day in the past 3 years, Rachel replied calmly. "I haven't been disorderly, and I wasn't interfering with legitimate police work. I was trying to help a fellow veteran who was having a psychological crisis." Jameson stepped forward aggressively. "She's lying. She was drunk and belligerent, interfering with official police business." Captain Kim immediately moved between them. "Officer, I advise you to stop making public statements that could be used against you in the civil rights lawsuit I'll be filing." The threat of legal action seemed to penetrate Jameson's rage, and for the first time, he looked around at the scene he'd created. Dozens of military personnel, multiple news crews, hundreds of onlookers, and his commanding officer handcuffed to a fence on charges that were looking more ridiculous by the minute. That's when Police Sergeant Mike Reeves arrived. Sergeant Reeves had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 15 years and had earned a reputation as a solid professional officer who believed in community policing and treating everyone with respect. He'd been at home when the duty sergeant called to inform him that one of his officers had arrested a military colonel and the situation was getting complicated. Reeves took in the scene with the experienced eye of a veteran law enforcement professional. He saw the media attention, the military personnel, the growing crowd, and most importantly, he saw Rachel Montgomery maintaining her dignity despite being chained to a fence. He'd heard of Colonel Montgomery. Of course, her regiment had assisted with disaster relief in the region, and her reputation among local emergency responders was excellent. The idea that she would be drunk and disorderly in a parking lot behind a bar was absurd. "Jameson," he called out sharply, "what the hell is going on here?" Jameson turned to his supervisor with obvious relief. "Sergeant, I arrested this woman for public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and interfering with police business. She's been belligerent and uncooperative." Reeves looked at Rachel, who was standing calmly despite her restraints, then at Jameson, whose face was flushed and whose uniform was disheveled from his aggressive handling of the situation. It was immediately clear to him who was being belligerent. "Did you administer a breathalyzer test?" Reeves asked. "Well, no, but did you follow standard procedures for detention and arrest?" "The situation was complicated. Officer Jameson, uncuff her immediately." "But Sergeant, that wasn't a suggestion, officer. Uncuff Colonel Montgomery right now." The relief in the parking lot was palpable. Rachel rubbed her wrists as the handcuffs were removed, maintaining her professional composure despite the ordeal. The crowd applauded, and several of her officers moved to surround her protectively, but the damage was already done. Videos of the incident were spreading across social media. News crews were broadcasting live reports, and the story was being picked up by national outlets. Within an hour, "Military Colonel handcuffed to fence by police" would be trending on Twitter. Sergeant Reeves approached Rachel with obvious embarrassment. "Colonel Montgomery, I apologize for this incident. Officer Jameson acted inappropriately, and this entire situation should never have happened." Rachel nodded graciously. "Thank you, Sergeant. I understand that law enforcement officers face difficult situations every day, and I don't hold the entire department responsible for one officer's poor judgment." Her graciousness only made Jameson's behavior look worse by comparison. Here was a woman who had been publicly humiliated and falsely arrested, and she was still taking the high road. "However," Rachel continued, "I am concerned about the treatment of Mr. Chen, the elderly veteran who was the original subject of this encounter. Is he receiving appropriate care?" Reeves looked confused. "Mr. Chen?" Tommy Chen had been largely forgotten in the chaos surrounding Rachel's arrest. He was still sitting in the back of Mill's patrol car, probably wondering what was happening and why the parking lot was full of military personnel and news crews. "He's a Vietnam veteran with PTSD, Rachel explained. "He was having an episode when your officers encountered him. Rather than recognizing his condition and providing appropriate assistance, they chose to treat him as a criminal." This was another problem Reeves hadn't anticipated. If Jameson had mishandled not just a decorated military officer, but also an elderly veteran with PTSD, the department's liability issues were going to multiply exponentially. "Release Mr. Chen immediately," Reeves ordered Mills, "and get him whatever assistance he needs." As Tommy was being helped from the patrol car, Rachel approached him with genuine concern. "Mr. Chen, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" The elderly veteran looked at her with confusion and gratitude. "Colonel, what happened? Why are all these people here?" "It's a long story, Mr. Chen. The important thing is that you're safe now." As Rachel comforted the elderly veteran who had inadvertently triggered the entire incident, the cameras captured every moment. Here was a woman who had just been publicly humiliated and falsely arrested, and her first concern was for the welfare of a homeless veteran she barely knew. The contrast with Officer Jameson's behavior couldn't have been more stark. Fort Harrison's commanding officer, Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, was in the middle of a budget meeting when her aide knocked urgently on her door. Colonel Thompson entered with an expression that immediately told her something significant had happened. "General, we have a situation involving Colonel Montgomery." General Hayes had known Rachel Montgomery for 8 years, ever since Rachel had been a major serving under her command in Afghanistan. In all that time, she'd never received a report of Rachel being involved in any kind of misconduct or inappropriate behavior. "What kind of situation?" she asked, already dreading the answer. "She's been arrested by Millbrook Police, ma'am. The charges appear to be false, and the incident has already made national news." General Hayes immediately pulled up the news coverage on her computer, watching in disbelief as video footage showed one of her most respected officers handcuffed to a fence. She'd served in the military for 26 years and had never seen anything quite like it. "Get me the Pentagon," she said without taking her eyes off the screen. "This is going to require some very careful handling." While General Hayes was making calls to higher headquarters, Rachel was finally free to address her assembled regiment. The parking lot had become an impromptu command post, with officers and NCOs providing updates on media coverage, legal implications, and the growing public response to the incident. "Listen up, everyone," Rachel called out, her voice carrying the authority that had made her one of the most respected leaders in the Corps of Engineers. "I appreciate your loyalty and your quick response to this situation. But I want to make something absolutely clear. We are professional soldiers, and we will handle this matter professionally." Lieutenant Rodriguez approached with her tablet, showing Rachel the social media response. "Ma'am, this has gone viral. #JusticeForColonel is trending, and we're getting messages of support from military units around the world." Rachel reviewed the screen with growing concern. While she appreciated the support, she was worried about the incident escalating beyond her control. She'd spent her entire career building bridges between the military and civilian communities, and the last thing she wanted was for this to create lasting animosity. "Sergeant Santos," she called out, "I need you to coordinate with local media. We're going to give one statement, and then we're returning to base. This situation needs to be de-escalated, not inflamed." But even as Rachel was trying to maintain control over the narrative, forces were already in motion that would make that impossible. The video of her arrest had been seen by millions of people, and the response was overwhelmingly supportive of the colonel and critical of the Millbrook Police Department. Within 6 hours of the arrest, #JusticeForColonel had been tweeted over 200,000 times. The video footage showed such a clear contrast between Rachel's professional dignity and Officer Jameson's aggressive behavior that even people who typically supported law enforcement were outraged by what they saw. Dr. Amanda Foster, a military psychologist at Walter Reed Medical Center, was among the first to recognize the broader implications of the incident. She'd known Rachel professionally for several years and had worked with her on veteran mental health initiatives. "This isn't just about one arrest," she posted on her widely followed Twitter account. "This is about how we treat veterans, how we handle mental health crises, and how some people in authority abuse their power." Colonel Montgomery was trying to help an elderly veteran in crisis, and she was handcuffed to a fence for it. The post was retweeted thousands of times, and Dr. Foster's analysis was picked up by major news outlets. Soon, the story was being covered not just as a case of police misconduct, but as a broader example of societal failures in supporting veterans. Marcus Williams, Rachel's former platoon sergeant from Afghanistan, was working construction in Detroit when he saw the video on his phone. He immediately called in sick to work and drove 10 hours straight to Fort Harrison. By the time he arrived that evening, dozens of other veterans were already gathering outside the base gates. "I served with Colonel Montgomery in Helmand Province," Marcus told a reporter. "She saved my life and the lives of my squad when we were pinned down by enemy fire. She built a bridge under fire so we could evacuate our wounded." The idea that some small-town cop would treat her like a criminal makes me sick. Similar stories were emerging from veterans across the country. Social media was flooded with testimonials from soldiers who had served under Rachel's command, each one adding to the growing narrative of a decorated officer who had been wronged by an out-of-control police officer. The response wasn't limited to the military community. Civil rights organizations, veteran advocacy groups, and even some law enforcement agencies issued statements supporting Rachel and criticizing the Millbrook Police Department's handling of the situation. Police Chief William Morrison had been fishing at his cabin when the calls started coming in. By the time he drove back to Millbrook that evening, his department was at the center of a national controversy that threatened to destroy his career and bankrupt his municipality. Morrison was a 25-year law enforcement veteran who had worked hard to build positive relationships between his department and the community. The idea that one of his officers had created this kind of disaster was almost impossible for him to process. "Tell me exactly what happened," he demanded when he called Jameson into his office. Jameson's account of the incident painted him as the victim of military intimidation and media bias. In his version, Rachel had been belligerent and threatening, and he'd simply followed standard procedures for dealing with an uncooperative suspect. "Chief, you weren't there," Jameson insisted. "She was throwing her rank around, trying to interfere with my investigation. I had to show her that civilian law enforcement doesn't bow down to the military." Morrison watched the video footage again, trying to reconcile Jameson's account with what he was seeing on screen. The woman in the video appeared calm and professional throughout the entire incident, while Jameson looked increasingly erratic and aggressive. "Derek, you handcuffed a decorated military officer to a fence on charges that you can't support with evidence. We're already getting calls from the mayor, the city council, the state attorney general's office, and God knows who else. This is a disaster." But Jameson was beyond rational thought. The criticism and media attention had only hardened his position, and he was convinced that admitting any wrongdoing would end his career. "I stand by my actions," he said defiantly. "If the military wants to play politics, that's their choice. But I did my job according to department procedures." Morrison realized he was dealing with an officer who was either delusional or lying. Either way, Jameson had become a liability that the department couldn't afford. "You're suspended pending a full investigation," Morrison announced. "Turn in your badge and weapon. And Derek, don't talk to any reporters. You've done enough damage already." By the next morning, Captain Sarah Kim had filed formal complaints with 5 different agencies: the State Attorney General's office, the FBI Civil Rights Division, the State Police Internal Affairs Unit, the County District Attorney's Office, and the military's Liaison Office for Civilian Law Enforcement Cooperation. Each complaint was meticulously documented, with witness statements, video evidence, and a detailed legal analysis of the violations that had occurred. Captain Kim had spent most of the night preparing the paperwork, and her thoroughness was evident in every document. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Federal investigators announced they would be reviewing the incident for potential civil rights violations. The State Attorney General's office opened its own investigation into the Millbrook Police Department's policies and procedures. The county prosecutor announced that all charges against Rachel would be dropped and that the department would face scrutiny over its handling of the case. Attorney General Susan Walsh, the state's top law enforcement official, personally reviewed the case file and was appalled by what she found. A decorated military officer had been subjected to degrading treatment based on no evidence whatsoever, while an elderly veteran with PTSD had been treated as a criminal rather than someone in need of assistance. "This case represents everything that's wrong with modern policing," she told her staff during an emergency meeting. "It shows a complete disregard for civil rights, proper procedures, and basic human decency. We're going to investigate this department from top to bottom." Meanwhile, the FBI's Civil Rights Division was conducting its own preliminary review. Special Agent Jennifer Murphy, who specialized in law enforcement misconduct cases, recognized immediately that this incident had the potential to become a major federal case. "The video evidence is damning," she told her supervisor. "We have a clear case of false arrest, possibly excessive force, and definitely a violation of the victim's civil rights. This officer's conduct was so far outside the bounds of acceptable law enforcement that it suggests either inadequate training or deliberate misconduct." The incident was also drawing attention from political leaders at every level. Senator Patricia Coleman, a former Army officer herself, issued a statement condemning the treatment of Colonel Montgomery and calling for a full investigation. "Colonel Montgomery is a hero who has served our country with distinction for over 18 years, Senator Coleman's statement read. "The idea that she would be handcuffed to a fence while trying to help a fellow veteran is not just wrong. It's un-American. This incident demands accountability and reform." Congressman Michael Torres, whose district included both Fort Harrison and Millbrook, found himself in the difficult position of trying to balance support for law enforcement with outrage over the incident. After reviewing the video footage, however, his position became clear. "I've watched the video of Colonel Montgomery's arrest multiple times, and I'm appalled by what I see," Torres announced at a hastily called press conference. "This was not law enforcement. This was abuse of power. I'm calling for the immediate termination of Officer Jameson and a complete review of the Millbrook Police Department." The political pressure was mounting from all directions. Governor Sarah Mitchell, facing re-election in 6 months, couldn't afford to be seen as soft on police misconduct, especially when it involved a decorated military officer. She announced the formation of a special commission to review police training and accountability measures throughout the state. The response from Millbrook's own residents was mixed, but increasingly critical of the police department's handling of the situation. Mayor Patricia Hendricks found herself fielding angry calls from constituents who were embarrassed by the national attention their town was receiving. "This is not who we are," Hendricks told reporters. "Millbrook has always been a community that supports our military and our veterans. What happened to Colonel Montgomery does not represent our values." But for every resident who was appalled by the incident, there was another who supported Officer Jameson's actions. A small but vocal group of Jameson supporters organized a rally outside the police station, carrying signs that read, "Support our police," and "Military doesn't rule civilians." The rally was organized by Brad Stevens, the city councilman who had clashed with Rachel during the housing meeting. Stevens saw the incident as an opportunity to advance his own political agenda and rally support for his anti-military views. "This is about civilian control," Stevens told the crowd of about 50 supporters. "We cannot allow the military to intimidate our law enforcement officers. Officer Jameson was doing his job, and he's being crucified by the media and the military-industrial complex." The counter-rally organized by local veterans was 10 times larger. Led by Marcus Williams and other veterans who had driven to Millbrook to show support for Rachel, over 500 people gathered in the town square to demand justice. "Colonel Montgomery was trying to help one of our own," Marcus told the crowd. "She saw an elderly veteran in crisis, and she did what any decent person would do. She tried to help. And for that, she was treated like a criminal. This is not about military versus civilian. This is about right versus wrong." Despite the overwhelming public support, the incident was taking a personal toll on Rachel that she tried to hide from her officers and the media. She'd built her entire career on the principle of building bridges between the military and civilian communities, and the polarization surrounding her arrest felt like a personal failure. She was in her quarters that evening, reviewing the day's events when there was a knock at her door. Sergeant Santos entered with a cup of coffee and the expression of someone who knew her commander better than Rachel sometimes knew herself. "Ma'am, you need to eat something," Santos said, setting down a plate with a sandwich. "And don't tell me you're not hungry. I've been watching you for 2 days, and you've barely touched food." Rachel accepted the sandwich gratefully. "Maria, this whole situation is spiraling out of control. I was trying to help one elderly veteran, and now we've got a national controversy that's dividing communities and turning people against each other. With respect, ma'am, you didn't create this controversy. That jackass cop created it when he decided to handcuff you to a fence. You were doing what you always do, standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves." "But look at the cost," Rachel said, gesturing toward the news coverage on her television. "Protesters in the streets, federal investigations, political grandstanding. All because I couldn't find a better way to handle one small-town police officer." Santos sat down across from her commander, her expression serious. "Colonel, do you remember what you told me in Afghanistan when we were building that bridge under fire?" Rachel smiled slightly. "That the mission isn't complete until everyone gets home. Safely, that's right. And that old man, Tommy Chen, he got home safely because you stood up for him. Everything else is just noise." The conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. Lieutenant Rodriguez entered with an urgent expression. "Ma'am, we've got a problem. Officer Jameson has been giving interviews to right-wing media outlets. He's claiming this whole thing is a military conspiracy to undermine civilian law enforcement." Rachel felt her heart sink. The last thing she wanted was for this incident to become partisan political theater. "What exactly is he saying?" Sophia handed her a tablet showing a live interview on a cable news show. Jameson was in full uniform, looking directly into the camera with the confidence of someone who believed he was saving democracy. "The military thinks they can intimidate civilian law enforcement," Jameson was saying. "Colonel Montgomery was drunk and belligerent, interfering with a legitimate police investigation. But because she's got rank and political connections, everyone's trying to make me the villain." The interviewer, a host known for inflammatory rhetoric, was eating it up. "So you're saying this is really about military overreach?" "Absolutely. They showed up with trucks full of soldiers, tried to intimidate me into releasing a criminal suspect. This is exactly the kind of military interference in civilian affairs that our founding fathers warned against." Rachel watched in horror as Jameson constructed a narrative that painted her as the aggressor and himself as a defender of constitutional principles. The fact that video evidence completely contradicted his account didn't seem to matter to either Jameson or his interviewer. "Ma'am," Sophia said quietly, "we need to respond to this. He's doing interviews with 3 more shows tonight, and they're all using the same talking points." But Rachel was thinking bigger picture. The incident had already caused enough division and controversy. Engaging in a media war with Jameson would only make things worse. "No," she said finally. "We're not going to dignify this with a response. The facts speak for themselves, and the investigations will reveal the truth. Getting into a public argument with Officer Jameson will only give him more platforms to spread his lies." It was a principled decision, but as events would prove, it was also a strategic mistake. While Rachel maintained her dignified silence, Jameson's narrative was beginning to take hold in certain circles, creating a parallel version of events that would complicate everything that followed. FBI Special Agent Jennifer Murphy arrived in Millbrook on a gray Monday morning, 3 days after the incident. She'd spent the weekend reviewing video footage, witness statements, and Officer Jameson's personnel file, and what she'd found had convinced her that this case was worth the Bureau's full attention. Murphy was a 12-year veteran of the FBI who had investigated dozens of civil rights cases involving law enforcement misconduct. She'd seen police officers make mistakes, use poor judgment, and occasionally cross the line into criminal behavior. But she'd rarely seen conduct as blatantly inappropriate as what was captured in the videos from Murphy's Bar parking lot. Her first stop was the Millbrook Police Department, where Chief Morrison was waiting with obvious apprehension. Morrison had been a cop long enough to know that when the FBI showed up to investigate one of your officers, it was never good news. "Chief Morrison, I'm Special Agent Murphy," she said, showing her credentials. "I'm here to investigate the arrest of Colonel Montgomery for potential civil rights violations." Morrison had prepared for this moment, and he was determined to be completely cooperative. "Agent Murphy, I want to assure you that this department will provide full cooperation with your investigation. What Officer Jameson did was wrong, and we're committed to getting to the bottom of it." Murphy appreciated the chief's candor, but she'd learned not to trust initial statements from law enforcement administrators. Too often, they were more concerned with protecting their departments than finding the truth. "I'll need to interview Officer Jameson, review his personnel file, and examine your department's policies and training records," she said. "I'll also need access to any internal communications about this incident." "Of course. But I should warn you, Jameson has been giving media interviews against my direct orders. He's hired a lawyer and seems to think he can turn this into some kind of political cause." This was interesting information. In Murphy's experience, officers who hired lawyers and went to the media were usually trying to control a narrative because they knew the facts weren't on their side. "Has he made any statements about his actions that day?" Morrison looked uncomfortable. "He's sticking to his story that Colonel Montgomery was intoxicated and belligerent. But Agent Murphy, I've watched the video footage dozens of times. That woman was the most professional person in that parking lot." Murphy's next stop was the county jail, where she interviewed Tommy Chen. The elderly veteran had been released without charges, but the experience had clearly been traumatic for him. He was staying at a local shelter, and Murphy found him sitting alone in the common area, staring out the window. "Mr. Chen, I'm FBI Special Agent Murphy. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened the other day." Tommy looked up with watery eyes, his hands shaking slightly. "I keep thinking about it. That lady colonel, she was just trying to help me, and they treated her so bad." Murphy sat down across from him, her voice gentle. "Can you tell me what happened from the beginning?" Tommy's account was heartbreaking. He'd been having a PTSD episode triggered by the smell of cooking grease that reminded him of Vietnam. He'd found a quiet spot behind the dumpster where he could sit and try to calm down, something his VA counselor had taught him to do. "I wasn't bothering nobody," he said. "I was just trying to get my head straight. Then those cops showed up and started yelling at me, treating me like I was some kind of criminal." "What happened when Colonel Montgomery arrived?" Tommy's face brightened slightly. She was like an angel. "She talked to me real gentle, asked if I was okay, if I needed help. She understood what was happening to me. Most people, they don't understand." "Did she appear to be intoxicated or behaving inappropriately?" Tommy looked shocked. "That lady? No way. She was the most together person there. She was trying to help me and help those cops understand what was going on. They should have listened to her." Murphy's interview with Tommy confirmed what the video evidence had already shown. Rachel Montgomery had been trying to de-escalate a situation involving a veteran in crisis, and her arrest had been completely unjustified. While the FBI investigation was beginning, the media attention around the incident was intensifying rather than dying down. Jameson's decision to give interviews had backfired spectacularly, as most viewers could see the contradiction between his claims and the video evidence. But his appearances had also energized a small but vocal group of supporters who saw his case as a symbol of broader cultural conflicts. Right-wing media personalities began framing the incident as an example of military overreach and liberal bias in the mainstream media. Rachel found herself at the center of a culture war she had never wanted to join. Conservative commentators who had never heard of her before were now analyzing her career, her politics, and her personal life in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. "They're trying to turn this into something it's not," she told General Hayes during a secure phone call. This was never about military versus civilian authority. It was about helping a veteran in crisis. General Hayes had been fielding calls from the Pentagon, Congress, and the White House about the incident. The military's leadership was unanimously supportive of Rachel, but they were also concerned about the broader implications for civil-military relations. "Rachel, I need you to understand that this has become bigger than just you," the general said. "The Secretary of Defense has been briefed, and there are people in Washington who want to use this incident to advance their own agendas. You're going to need to be very careful about how you handle the next few weeks." The warning proved prescient. That afternoon, Rachel received a call from a producer at CNN requesting an interview. Similar requests were coming in from every major news outlet, talk show, and podcast in the country. Captain Kim, who had become Rachel's de facto legal and media advisor, strongly recommended against any interviews. "Ma'am, anything you say will be analyzed and potentially taken out of context. The best strategy is to let the investigations proceed and speak through our actions, not our words." But the media attention was making it difficult for Rachel to do her job. Reporters were camped outside Fort Harrison's gates. Her regiment was being bombarded with interview requests, and the constant speculation about her motives and actions was affecting morale throughout the unit. In Washington, the incident was being viewed through the lens of electoral politics and policy debates that had nothing to do with what had actually happened in a parking lot behind Murphy's Bar. Senator Coleman, who had initially issued a strong statement supporting Rachel, was now getting pressure from police unions in her home state who felt she had been too quick to condemn Officer Jameson. The unions argued that the senator was undermining law enforcement morale by supporting the military over civilian police. At the same time, progressive activists were using the incident to highlight broader issues of police accountability and veteran care. They wanted to use Rachel's case as a platform for discussing systemic problems in law enforcement and society's treatment of military veterans. Congressional hearings were being planned, with both parties seeing opportunities to advance their agendas. Republicans wanted to focus on military overreach and the importance of civilian control over the armed forces. Democrats wanted to discuss police reform and veteran support services. None of these political calculations had anything to do with the simple truth of what had happened. A police officer had abused his authority, and a military officer had been wrongly arrested while trying to help a fellow veteran. While Rachel was trying to manage the political and media aspects of the crisis, her regiment was dealing with more practical concerns. The 342nd had become the center of national attention, and every member of the unit was feeling the pressure. Lieutenant Rodriguez was fielding dozens of interview requests daily, while also trying to maintain normal operations. The regiment had construction projects that needed to be completed, training schedules that had to be maintained, and administrative responsibilities that couldn't be ignored just because their commander had become a national news story. "We need to get back to normal operations," Rachel told her staff during their daily briefing. "This regiment has a mission, and we can't let this incident distract us from serving our soldiers and our country." But normal operations were difficult. When reporters were trying to interview every member of the regiment about their experiences serving under Rachel's command, most of the soldiers were fiercely loyal to their colonel and angry about her treatment, but they were also professional enough to follow orders about not speaking to the media. Sergeant Santos took a different approach. She organized informal gatherings where soldiers could discuss their feelings about the incident and get support from their peers. These sessions became a way for the regiment to process the stress and maintain unit cohesion despite the external pressures. "The colonels taught us that we take care of each other," Santos told a group of NCOs. "Right now, that means taking care of her by doing our jobs and staying focused on our mission." Not everyone in Millbrook was happy with the attention their town was receiving. Local business owners were concerned about the impact on tourism and the town's reputation. Some residents felt that the incident was being blown out of proportion by the media and outside agitators. Mayor Hendricks found herself in an impossible position. She personally believed that Officer Jameson had acted inappropriately, but she also had to consider the interests of her constituents and the financial impact of the ongoing controversy. The town was facing potential lawsuits that could bankrupt the municipality. Insurance companies were already making inquiries about coverage for civil rights violations. The police department's reputation was in ruins, and recruitment of new officers was going to be extremely difficult. "We're a small town," Hendricks told her staff. "We don't have the resources to fight a federal civil rights lawsuit or deal with this kind of national attention. We need to find a way to resolve this situation before it destroys our community." But resolution was proving elusive. Officer Jameson refused to admit any wrongdoing. His supporters were demanding that he be reinstated, and the federal investigation was just beginning. The incident had created divisions within the community that wouldn't be easily healed. Despite her professional composure, the incident was taking a significant personal toll on Rachel. She'd spent her entire career building bridges between military and civilian communities, and the polarization surrounding her arrest felt like a repudiation of everything she'd worked for. She was also worried about the impact on her family. Rachel's mother, now 78 and living in a nursing home in Montana, had seen the news coverage and was deeply distressed by the images of her daughter being handcuffed to a fence. "She keeps asking me why they treated you like that," Rachel's sister Sarah told her during a phone call. "I don't know what to tell her. She's so proud of your service, and seeing you humiliated like that is breaking her heart." Rachel had always been intensely private about her personal life, but the media attention was making privacy impossible. Reporters were digging into her background, her relationships, and her motivations. Every aspect of her life was being scrutinized and analyzed by people who had never met her. The stress was also affecting her relationship with her longtime partner, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a civilian contractor who worked on military engineering projects. Jennifer had been supportive throughout the crisis, but the constant media attention was straining their relationship. "I just want our normal life back," Jennifer told Rachel one evening as they watched protesters marching outside the base gates. "I'm proud of what you did, but I hate seeing you go through this." Special Agent Murphy's investigation was revealing disturbing patterns in Officer Jameson's behavior that went far beyond the incident with Rachel. His personnel file contained multiple complaints about excessive force, inappropriate conduct, and what his colleagues described as an attitude problem. 3 years earlier, Jameson had been involved in an incident where he'd arrested a college student for disrespecting an officer after the student had asked to see his badge number. The charges had been dropped, but the incident had resulted in a formal complaint that had been buried in his file. 2 years ago, he'd been accused of using excessive force during the arrest of a domestic violence suspect. The investigation had been inconclusive, but several witnesses had described Jameson's behavior as unnecessarily aggressive. Most troubling was a pattern of behavior toward military personnel. Murphy discovered that Jameson had issued an unusually high number of citations to soldiers from Fort Harrison, often for minor violations that other officers would have handled with warnings. "This officer has a history of antagonistic behavior toward military personnel," Murphy told her supervisor during a briefing. The incident with Colonel Montgomery wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a pattern of bias and abuse of authority. The discovery of this pattern was significant because it suggested that Jameson's actions weren't just poor judgment in a single incident, but evidence of a systematic bias that could support federal civil rights charges. As the investigation continued, Millbrook was becoming increasingly divided. The initial shock and embarrassment over the incident was giving way to entrenched positions that seemed to have more to do with broader political affiliations than the specific facts of the case. Brad Stevens, the city councilman, was organizing Jameson's supporters into a more formal political movement. They held rallies, created social media groups, and began pressuring other local officials to defend the police officer. "This is about standing up for law and order," Stevens told a crowd of supporters. "If we let the military intimidate our police officers, what's next? Are we going to let them take over our schools, our government, our way of life?" The rhetoric was becoming increasingly heated and divorced from reality. Stevens and his supporters were portraying the incident as part of a broader conspiracy by the military-industrial complex to undermine civilian authority. On the other side, veteran groups and civil rights organizations were organizing their own rallies and petition drives. They demanded Jameson's termination, reforms to police training and accountability, and a formal apology to Colonel Montgomery. The divide was tearing apart families and friendships in Millbrook. People who had known each other for decades were no longer speaking because of their positions on the incident. The local newspaper was receiving angry letters and canceling subscriptions from readers who disagreed with its editorial positions. In Washington, the incident was prompting broader discussions about police accountability, military-civilian relations, and the treatment of veterans. The Department of Justice announced that it would be reviewing police practices in Millbrook as part of a broader pattern and practice investigation. Attorney General Sarah Martinez personally reviewed the case file and decided that the department would seek federal civil rights charges against Officer Jameson. This case represents exactly the kind of police misconduct that the Justice Department was created to address, she announced at a press conference. The decision to pursue federal charges was significant because it meant that even if local prosecutors declined to file charges, Jameson would still face serious legal consequences for his actions. The Pentagon was also taking action. The Secretary of Defense ordered a review of all protocols for military personnel interacting with civilian law enforcement. The goal was to prevent future incidents while ensuring that military personnel understood their rights when dealing with civilian police. As more details about Jameson's history emerged, the media narrative began to shift. Initial coverage had focused on the dramatic contrast between the handcuffed colonel and the aggressive police officer. Now, reporters were digging deeper into systemic issues of police accountability and the treatment of veterans. Investigative journalists uncovered additional incidents involving Jameson that painted a picture of an officer who had been allowed to abuse his authority for years without meaningful consequences. The Millbrook Police Department's failure to address his pattern of misconduct became part of the story. National news magazines began featuring in-depth profiles of Rachel, exploring her background, her military service, and her philosophy of leadership. These articles portrayed her as a reluctant hero who had been thrust into the spotlight for doing what she believed was right. The contrast between the two central figures in the drama was stark. Rachel was portrayed as a decorated war hero who had dedicated her life to serving others. Jameson was increasingly seen as a symbol of everything wrong with modern policing, but the media attention was also revealing the complex political and social tensions that the incident had exposed. The story had become a Rorschach test that people interpreted based on their own beliefs about authority, military service, police power, and civil rights. As the investigation continued and the legal proceedings began, it was clear that the incident behind Murphy's Bar had become something much larger than anyone had anticipated. What had started as a simple case of police misconduct had evolved into a national conversation about fundamental questions of justice, authority, and the values that define American society. The stage was set for confrontations that would test everyone involved and ultimately determine not just the fate of the individuals at the center of the drama, but the broader principles they had come to represent. 3 weeks after the incident, Special Agent Murphy made a discovery that would change everything. While reviewing Officer Jameson's personal communications, she found evidence that suggested his actions might not have been spontaneous but part of a broader pattern of targeting military personnel. Murphy had obtained a warrant for Jameson's phone records and social media accounts, and what she found was deeply troubling. For months before the incident with Rachel, Jameson had been participating in online forums where he expressed increasingly anti-military sentiments. "These military officers think they're better than everyone else," he had posted in one forum. "Someone needs to show them that their rank doesn't mean anything in the real world." More disturbing were private messages between Jameson and other forum members where they discussed ways to put military personnel in their place. The conversations revealed a coordinated effort among certain law enforcement officers to target and harass military personnel whenever possible. Murphy immediately called her supervisor. "Sir, this is bigger than we thought. Jameson appears to have been part of an organized effort to target military personnel. We may be looking at conspiracy charges." The discovery transformed the investigation from a single incident of police misconduct into a potential federal conspiracy case. Murphy began identifying other law enforcement officers who had been involved in the online discussions and investigating whether they had acted on their anti-military bias. As Murphy's investigation expanded, she discovered that Jameson's online network included police officers from 6 different states. The group had been sharing information about military personnel in their jurisdictions and coordinating efforts to harass them through excessive traffic stops, frivolous citations, and intimidation tactics. The leader of the group was revealed to be Lieutenant David Park of the Phoenix Police Department, a 20-year veteran who had been passed over for promotion multiple times and blamed his failures on what he called military favoritism. In law enforcement hiring, Park had created the online forum as a way to connect like-minded officers who resented the military. Over time, the group had evolved from a place to vent frustrations into an active conspiracy to target military personnel for harassment and false arrests. The FBI's investigation revealed dozens of incidents across multiple states where military personnel had been subjected to inappropriate police conduct. In many cases, the officers involved had documented their actions in the online forum, bragging about their ability to humble military officers. Agent Murphy was particularly disturbed by one post from Jameson dated 2 weeks before the incident. "With Rachel, there's a military colonel coming to our town for some meeting. Might be time to show her what real authority looks like." This post suggested that Jameson's encounter with Rachel hadn't been coincidental at all. He had known she was coming to Millbrook and had been looking for an opportunity to target her. When General Hayes briefed Rachel on the FBI's discoveries, the colonel was stunned. She had assumed that Jameson's behavior was the result of personal bias or poor training, not part of an organized conspiracy against military personnel. "Ma'am, this changes everything," Rachel said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "This wasn't just one bad officer having a bad day. This was a deliberate, coordinated attack on military personnel across multiple states." General Hayes nodded. Grimly, "The Pentagon is taking this very seriously. The Secretary of Defense is personally briefing the President tomorrow morning. This kind of conspiracy against military personnel is considered a national security issue." Rachel sat back in her chair, processing the implications. Every traffic stop, every citation, every moment of harassment that military personnel had endured at the hands of these officers now took on a sinister new meaning. It wasn't random bias. It was an organized campaign of intimidation. "General, I need permission to make a public statement," Rachel said. "The military community needs to know about this conspiracy. They need to understand that what happened to me was part of something much larger." But General Hayes shook her head. "Rachel, I understand your desire to speak out. But this is now an active federal investigation involving multiple jurisdictions. The FBI has requested that we maintain operational security until they can complete their arrests. The waiting was torture for Rachel. She knew that every day the conspiracy remained secret was another day that military personnel across the country could be targeted by these rogue officers. But she also understood the importance of letting the FBI complete their investigation at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. 6 weeks after the incident at Murphy's Bar, FBI agents executed simultaneous arrest warrants in 6 states. The coordinated operation, dubbed Operation Shield, resulted in the arrest of 12 law enforcement officers on federal conspiracy charges. Lieutenant David Park was arrested at his home in Phoenix, found in possession of detailed files on military personnel. In his jurisdiction, the files contained personal information, duty schedules, and what prosecutors would later describe as target lists for harassment. Officer Derek Jameson was arrested at the Millbrook Police Department, where he had been working desk duty since his suspension. His arrest was broadcast live on local news, the handcuffs a stark reminder of how he had treated Rachel just weeks earlier. The other arrests took place across the country, in Texas, Georgia, Colorado, North Carolina, and Washington State. Each officer was charged with conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, a federal crime that carried a maximum sentence of life in prison. The FBI's press conference that afternoon sent shockwaves through both law enforcement and military communities. Agent Murphy, flanked by senior bureau officials, outlined the scope of the conspiracy in stark detail. For over 2 years, this group of law enforcement officers engaged in a systematic campaign to target, harass, and intimidate military personnel. Murphy announced, they used their badges and authority to pursue personal vendettas against the men and women who serve our country. This betrayal of their oath as police officers and their duty as Americans will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The trial of the 12 officers began 8 months later in federal court in Washington, D.C. The Justice Department had decided to try all the defendants together to demonstrate the scope and coordination of the conspiracy. Rachel found herself as the government's star witness, a role she had never wanted but accepted as a duty. Her testimony was scheduled for the 3rd day of the trial, and she spent hours preparing with federal prosecutors. Colonel Montgomery, lead prosecutor Sarah Chun, explained during preparation, "Your case is what broke this conspiracy open. Your dignity and professionalism during that incident made it impossible for the defendants to justify their actions." The courtroom was packed when Rachel took the stand. Media outlets from around the world had sent reporters to cover what was being called the most significant police corruption trial in decades. In the gallery, she could see members of her regiment, fellow veterans, and even Tommy Chen, who had become an unexpected symbol of the conspiracy's victims. Rachel's testimony was methodical and powerful. She described the events at Murphy's Bar in precise detail, but more importantly, she testified about the broader impact of the conspiracy on military-civilian relations. "The defendants didn't just violate my civil rights," Rachel told the jury. "They attacked the fundamental principle that military personnel are citizens first, soldiers second. They tried to create a climate of fear and intimidation that would discourage military members from participating in their communities." Under cross-examination, Jameson's attorney tried to portray Rachel as an authoritarian military officer who had overstepped her bounds. The strategy backfired spectacularly when the attorney suggested that Rachel had been throwing her weight around. "Counselor," Rachel replied calmly, "I was trying to help an elderly veteran who was having a PTSD episode. If helping a fellow American in distress is throwing my weight around, then I'm guilty as charged." The courtroom erupted in applause, and even the judge seemed moved by Rachel's response. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with testimony from dozens of military personnel who had been targeted by the conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. The defendants' own online communications provided a detailed record of their criminal activities. Tommy Chen's testimony was particularly powerful. The elderly veteran, supported by Rachel and her regiment throughout the legal process, spoke about the trauma of being treated as a criminal for having a mental health crisis. "I served my country in Vietnam," Tommy told the jury, his voice shaking with emotion. "I never thought I'd have to be afraid of the police in my own country." These officers didn't see a veteran who needed help. They saw an opportunity to hurt someone they thought was weak. The defense's attempts to justify the officers' actions fell flat. Claims of maintaining order and asserting civilian authority were contradicted by the defendants' own words in their online forums, where they had bragged about targeting military personnel for sport. After deliberating for less than 8 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts against all 12 defendants. The conspiracy charges alone carried sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. During the sentencing phase, Rachel made a victim impact statement that would be remembered as one of the most powerful moments in the trial. "Your Honors," she addressed the court, "these defendants didn't just attack me or the other military personnel they targeted. They attacked the very idea that we are all equal under the law. They used their badges as weapons to pursue personal vendettas and political agendas. But they failed because the truth has a power that no conspiracy can overcome." Judge Patricia Williams sentenced the ringleader, Lieutenant Park, to 18 years in federal prison. Jameson received 15 years, while the other defendants received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. In the aftermath of the trial, Rachel found herself at the center of a national conversation about police reform and veteran support. She had never sought the spotlight, but she embraced her role as an advocate for both law enforcement accountability and military-civilian cooperation. The 342nd Engineering Regiment returned to their normal duties, but their experience during the crisis had strengthened their bonds and their commitment to their colonel. Rachel's leadership during the most difficult period of her career had inspired absolute loyalty from her soldiers. Sergeant Santos, who had been promoted to Sergeant Major, reflected on the experience during a unit ceremony. "The colonel taught you was something important," she told the assembled regiment. "Sometimes standing up for what's right means standing up to people who think they have power over you. Sometimes the most important battles are fought with dignity and principles, not weapons." The incident also led to significant reforms in police training and oversight. The Justice Department established new protocols for investigating law enforcement misconduct, and Congress passed legislation requiring better coordination between military and civilian law enforcement agencies. Tommy Chen, with support from Rachel and her regiment, found stable housing and regular mental health care. He became an advocate for homeless veterans, speaking at conferences and helping others navigate the complex systems designed to help them. The relationship between Millbrook and Fort Harrison was rebuilt through careful diplomacy and genuine commitment to healing. Mayor Hendricks, working with General Hayes, established a civilian military council that met regularly to address issues before they could escalate. 2 years after the incident at Murphy's Bar, Rachel was promoted to Brigadier General, making her one of the youngest female generals in the Army Corps of Engineers. Her promotion ceremony was attended by hundreds of officers, enlisted personnel, and civilians whose lives she had touched. General Hayes, now retired, spoke at the ceremony about Rachel's character and leadership. "General Montgomery didn't choose to become a symbol," she said. "But when circumstances forced that role upon her, she carried it with the same dignity and professionalism she brings to everything she does." The incident had also changed Rachel personally. She had always been a private person who preferred to work behind the scenes, but she now understood the power of moral leadership and public example. She began speaking at military academies and civilian universities about leadership, civil rights, and the importance of standing up for principle. Her relationship with Dr. Jennifer Walsh had survived the crisis and grown stronger. They were married in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family, including many members of the 342nd Regiment who had become like family to both of them. Officer Derek Jameson, serving his sentence in federal prison, had become a cautionary tale told in police academies across the country. His fall from authority to convicted felon served as a reminder that badges and uniforms don't grant immunity from justice. The conspiracy he had been part of was largely dismantled, but Rachel knew that vigilance would always be necessary. Prejudice and abuse of power didn't disappear with a single trial. They required constant attention and commitment to justice. 5 years after her arrest, General Rachel Montgomery returned to Millbrook for the dedication of the Tommy Chen Veterans Center, a facility that provided housing, mental health services, and job training for homeless veterans. The center had been funded through a combination of federal grants, private donations, and ironically, part of the civil settlement the town had paid to resolve the lawsuit stemming from her arrest. Tommy Chen, now 78 and serving as the center's first resident advisor, welcomed Rachel with tears in his eyes. General, you saved my life that day. Not just from those cops, but from giving up on myself. The center was a testament to what could be accomplished when communities work together instead of against each other. It served veterans from 3 counties and had become a model for similar programs across the country. As Rachel toured the facility, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from that parking lot behind Murphy's Bar to this moment of triumph. The handcuffs, the humiliation, the media circus, the trial, all of it had led to something positive and meaningful. Standing in the center's common room, surrounded by veterans who had found hope and stability, Rachel remembered her philosophy. From Afghanistan, the mission isn't complete until everyone gets home safely. In a way, she realized, they were all still getting home, from wars, from trauma, from the various battles that life had thrown at them. The young soldier she had been, enlisting straight out of high school to help her family, never could have imagined the path her life would take. But that same commitment to service, to standing up for others, to doing what was right regardless of the cost, had guided her through every challenge. As the dedication ceremony concluded, Rachel was approached by a young police officer from the Millbrook PD, Officer Maria Santos. No relation to her sergeant major, was a recent academy graduate who had specifically requested assignment to Millbrook because of what she had learned about the case in her training. General Montgomery, the young officer said nervously, I just wanted you to know that your example inspired me to become a police officer. I want to be the kind of cop who protects people like you and Mr. Chen, not someone who abuses their authority. Rachel smiled and shook the young woman's hand. Officer Santos, that's all any of us can do. Try to leave things a little better than we found them. As Rachel drove away from Millbrook that evening, she thought about the inscription that now adorned the wall of the Tommy Chen Veterans Center. True authority comes not from a badge or a rank, but from the courage to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. It was a lesson that had cost her dearly to learn, but one that had ultimately made her a better leader, a better officer, and a better person. The girl from rural Montana who had joined the Army to help her family had grown into a general who had helped her country remember some of its most important values. The mission, as she had always known, was never really complete. But progress was possible, justice was achievable, and sometimes, standing up for what was right could change the world, one person, one incident, one moment of courage at a time. Stories like this require enormous amounts of research, careful plotting, and attention to character development. If this narrative has moved you, challenged you, or simply entertained you during these past hours, I would be incredibly grateful. If you would, hit that like button to show your support, subscribe to our channel for more epic, novel-length stories, share this story with friends who appreciate detailed, Immersive storytelling. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest releases. Your support allows us to continue creating these detailed, cinematic narratives that transport you to other worlds and explore the complexities of human nature. Whether it's military thrillers, historical epics, or contemporary dramas, we're committed to bringing you stories that matter. What did you think of Rachel's journey? Which character resonated most with you? Let us know in the comments below. Your feedback helps us craft even better stories for future episodes. Until our next adventure together, remember, sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons, but with dignity, principle, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time for another epic tale that will keep you on the edge of your seat.